When you're new to watercolour, it's very easy to be put off by the terminology, and it's really not very complicated at all. So today I'm going to hopefully simplify the two terms wet in wet and wet on dry, and these are really just as they sound. With wet on dry, we're simply painting wet paint onto dry paper. Very, very easy to remember. You're painting wet paint onto something that is dry. That may be dry paper, or it may be paint that's already dried, but you're never adding wet on top of wet. You're adding wet onto dry and allowing everything to completely dry between layers. For this example, I used cadmium yellow. I allowed that to completely dry, and then I'm going over the top with some cadmium red. I'll let that dry and then go over the top again with some Windsor violet. I'm not sure how, but you'll see I've got a smudged line in the centre of that red. I think I've got a little bit of black brusho or something on the tip of my brush that's done that, so I do apologise for that. So let each layer completely dry between colours. And if you want to have a go at this, you could use different colours and see how they layer up together. Of course, watercolours are transparent, so when you put your cadmium red on, the yellow is going to be shining through that and affecting the colour, making it into an orange. So really, you're mixing your colours on the paper when you're working in this fashion. With oils and acrylics, we mix all our colours on the palette and get the colour that we want. With watercolour, it's very different because you're using the white of the paper and the transparency of the subsequent colours. So by putting the red on top of the yellow, we're going to be making an orange. When using the term wet in wet, we're talking about putting wet paint off your brush onto a wet surface. Now that wet surface may be wet paper that you've put water onto, or it might be wet paint that you've just applied and that hasn't been allowed to dry. In this case, we're going to be putting wet paint into wet paint. And the important thing with this is that the second layer is thicker than the first. So in the first layer of the cadmium yellow, I've got lots more water and lots less paint pigment. In the second colour, which is the cadmium red, as in the top example, I've got a lot less water and much more pigment, so it's a thicker feeling consistency. And then again with the violet, that's thicker still, so less water and more paint. And in this way it will flow nicely into the paint that's already there without making what we call cauliflowers, which is where the water of a drier consistency drags the other water across and makes those shapes that we don't want. What happens with water is it attracts itself. So if you've got a slightly moist area that's starting to dry but that is still moist, and then you add into that higher concentration of water, so a much thinner paint mixture with lots of water in it, to that thicker paint mixture, that water is going to pull it and move it, and that's when we end up with these shapes that we don't like, called cauliflowers. And what happens is this happens over a period of time. So you'll do this and then you'll be working on another area of your painting, and you'll find half an hour later you look across and something that you think was really nice when you first did it has ended up looking a mess. You might want to try this yourself, perhaps with some different colours that are more obvious, to see just how it works. And sometimes, there's always exceptions to the rules, sometimes you might actually like this effect and it might be quite useful. It might be quite useful if you were doing this in some greens and blues and it made some tree shapes, or some, you know, kind of impressionistic shapes of bushes and things, or you might like it in a sunset or in water. There are occasions when this looks okay. And we talk about happy accidents, and sometimes with watercolour it can look lovely. However, 9 times out of 10 it looks a mess. So just be very, very careful when doing this, and have a practice and get used to your watercolours. When you're doing a painting, one area that you might notice is happening a lot is right at the edge of your paper, at the very tip of your paper, because what happens is the water pools there, and then when the paint dries on the interior of the paper, it pulls back that water that's pooled on the edge, and then you'll end up with these messes on the edge of your painting. So just keep an eye out for that, and you'll begin to understand what I mean by those drier areas pulling back that water. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you found it useful. I'll be back again soon with some more watercolour tips and tutorials. Thanks for watching, and bye bye for now.